The window watcher, when spying on your neighbors, reveals a deadly secret. The ice was invisible. That's what made it deadly. Jake Morrison was rushing down the concrete steps of St. Mary's Cathedral, his camera bag bouncing against his hip. The Reynolds wedding was supposed to start in 20 minutes, and he was already cutting it close. 3 years of freelance photography had taught him that being late to a wedding was professional suicide. He never saw the thin sheet of ice stretched across the fourth step. His right foot slipped forward while his left leg stayed planted. The crack was audible even over the morning traffic. Jake hit the concrete hard, his expensive camera equipment scattering across the sidewalk. The pain in his leg was immediate and absolute, a white-hot fire that made him vomit onto the church steps. "Don't move him," someone shouted. "Call 911. 6 hours later, Jake stared at the x-rays hanging on the light board in his hospital room. Dr. Williams pointed to the bright white lines running through his fibula and tibia. "Clean breaks in both bones," she explained. "You'll need surgery to insert pins, then 6 to 8 weeks in a cast. After that, physical therapy for another month or 2. Jake closed his eyes. No weddings. No portrait sessions. No income for at least 2 months. His savings account had maybe 3 weeks' worth of rent and groceries. "The good news," Dr. Williams continued, "is that you'll heal completely. The bad news is you need to stay off that leg. I mean it, Mr. Morrison. Crutches only, and even then minimal movement for the first month." 3 days later, Jake hobbled into his studio apartment on the 4th floor of the Riverside Lofts. The converted warehouse building had seemed perfect when he'd moved in 2 years ago. Affordable rent, huge windows for natural light, and an artsy neighborhood full of potential clients. Now, staring at the cast that ran from his toes to just below his knee, the 4th floor walk-up felt like a prison sentence. The apartment was a single large room with exposed brick walls and industrial-sized windows that faced west into the building's central courtyard. 5 other buildings surrounded the rectangular space, their windows creating a patchwork of lit squares against the evening darkness. Jake had never paid much attention to his neighbors before. He was usually out shooting weddings on weekends and editing photos during the week. The apartment was just a place to sleep and store equipment. But now, settling into his desk chair with his leg propped on a pillow, he found himself looking directly into the lives of dozens of strangers. The first week crawled by like a wounded animal. Jake tried to work, editing photos from his last wedding on his laptop, but his concentration was shot. The pain medication made him drowsy, and sitting still for hours made his back ache. He caught up on Netflix series, read photography blogs, and called his sister in Portland twice a day until she stopped answering. By day 10, he was climbing the walls. That's when he noticed the couple in 3B. Their apartment was directly across the courtyard, 1 floor down. They were young, maybe mid-20s, and from what Jake could see, attractive in that generic way of people who'd never faced real hardship. The woman had shoulder-length blonde hair and wore yoga pants like a uniform. The man was tall and lean with the kind of jaw that belonged in toothpaste commercials. They fought constantly. Jake first noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon. He was trying to read when raised voices carried across the courtyard. The woman, he started thinking of her as Blondie, was gesturing wildly while the man stood with his arms crossed. Even from 4 stories away, Jake could read the tension in their body language. The fight lasted 20 minutes. It ended when the man grabbed his jacket and stormed out, leaving Blondie standing alone by their window. "Trouble in paradise," Jake muttered, then felt immediately guilty for watching. But the next day, he found himself glancing toward 3B around the same time. Sure enough, another argument. This one ended with Blondie throwing something, a book, maybe, across their living room. By the end of the second week, Jake knew their schedule. The man, he started calling him Ken like the doll, left for work every morning at 8:15. Blondie did yoga by the window at 9:30, had lunch at noon, and usually started drinking wine around 4. Ken came home at 6:45, and the fighting began by 7:30. Jake told himself he wasn't really watching. He was just aware of them, the way you're aware of the neighbor's dog barking or the sound of traffic. But when he found himself moving his desk chair for a better view of 3B, he had to admit the truth. He was spying on his neighbors, and he was starting to enjoy it. The telephoto lens had been gathering dust in his camera bag since a wildlife shoot last spring. Jake dug it out on a rainy Thursday afternoon, telling himself he was just testing the equipment. The 400mm lens brought the courtyard into sharp focus. Details that had been fuzzy before suddenly became crystal clear. Through 3B's window, Jake could see Ken's face during the arguments, the way his jaw clenched, how his hands curled into fists. He could read Blondie's expression too, frustration mixing with something that looked like fear. But 3B wasn't the only show in town. Mr. Peterson in 4A was probably 70, with white hair and the careful movements of someone who'd outlived most of his friends. Jake watched him tend to his rooftop garden every morning, talking to his tomato plants like old companions. In the afternoons, Peterson sat by his window reading thick books and drinking tea from a chipped mug. The single mother in 2C had her hands full with 2 kids under 10. Jake learned her name was Linda when he heard her yelling it across the courtyard one afternoon. "Linda Martinez, you get back here this instant." The kids were energetic in the way that drove parents to drink coffee by the gallon. Jake watched Linda juggle homework help, dinner preparation, and what looked like freelance work on her laptop, all while maintaining the patience of a saint. The college kids in 1A threw parties that lasted until 3 a.m. and left beer cans on the fire escape. Their names seemed to change weekly. Either they had a lot of friends or Jake couldn't keep track of their revolving door of hookups. But it was 5B that really caught his attention. The apartment stayed dark most of the time, with heavy blackout curtains that never opened. Jake might have thought it was vacant except for the occasional signs of life, a shadow moving behind the curtains, the brief glow of a television or computer screen, the sound of footsteps in the hallway at odd hours. Whoever lived in 5B kept vampire hours and valued privacy above all else. Jake created a mental schedule of his neighbors' lives. Peterson's morning garden routine, Linda's afternoon homework battles, Ken and Blondie's evening arguments, the college kids' weekend parties. He told himself it was anthropological research, material for a future photo series about urban life and isolation. But late at night, when the courtyard was dark and quiet, Jake admitted the truth to himself. He was lonely. The broken leg had cut him off from his work, his routine, his entire social life. Watching his neighbors made him feel connected to something larger than his own 4 walls, even if that connection was completely one-sided. Week 3 brought the first real violence. Jake was eating dinner, Chinese takeout balanced on his lap, when the shouting started from 3B. This fight was different from the others. Louder. More desperate. Through the telephoto lens, Jake watched Ken grab Blondie's wrist and twist it behind her back. She cried out, the sound carrying clearly across the courtyard. Ken's face was red with anger, his free hand pointing at something Jake couldn't see. Blondie tried to pull away. Ken shoved her backward into their coffee table. She stumbled but didn't fall. Jake's finger hovered over his phone. He should call the police. This was assault, wasn't it? But what would he tell them? That he'd been spying on his neighbors with a telephoto lens and witnessed what might have been domestic violence? The fight ended when Ken stormed out, slamming the door so hard Jake heard it through his own walls. Blondie sank onto her couch and buried her face in her hands. Jake stared at his phone for 10 minutes before putting it away. He didn't even know their real names. And what if he was wrong? What if they were just having relationship problems and he'd misinterpreted what he'd seen? But the image of Blondie's twisted arm stayed with him all night. The next morning, Jake watched Ken leave for work as usual. His jaw was set, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. When Blondie appeared at the window an hour later, Jake zoomed in on her face. There was a dark mark on her left cheek that hadn't been there before. That afternoon, Jake researched domestic violence hotlines and anonymous reporting options. But every website asked for specifics he couldn't provide: names, addresses, details about the incident. Without those, any report would be useless. He was trapped between his conscience and his cowardice, watching a situation spiral out of control while remaining powerless to help. The irony wasn't lost on him. Before the accident, Jake had made his living capturing moments, preserving single instants of joy, love, and celebration. Now he was witnessing something terrible unfold in real time, and all he could do was watch. Friday night of week 4 changed everything. Jake had positioned himself by the window with coffee and his telephoto lens, settling in for the evening's entertainment. Ken and Blondie's Friday fights had become appointment television, terrible but compelling. But tonight, 3B's windows stayed dark. Ken's car wasn't in the parking lot. For the first time in weeks, Jake's main attraction was a no-show. Frustrated, he panned the lens across the other apartments. Peterson was reading by lamplight. Linda was helping her kids with what looked like a science project, baking soda volcanoes from the mess on their kitchen table. The college kids were pre-gaming for another party. And for the first time since Jake had been watching, 5B had its lights on. Through a gap in the blackout curtains, Jake could see into a sparsely furnished living room. A tall man in his 40s paced back and forth, talking on his phone. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face, even indoors. His apartment was almost empty, just a couch, a coffee table, and a large-screen TV. The man ended his call and disappeared from view. Jake waited, camera ready, hoping for another glimpse of the mysterious neighbor. At 9:47 p.m., someone knocked on 5B's door. The visitor was a woman Jake had never seen before. Brunette, average height, wearing jeans and a red jacket. The man in the baseball cap let her in quickly, checking the hallway before closing the door. Through the lens, Jake watched them talk. The conversation started calm but grew heated quickly. The woman gestured toward the door, as if she wanted to leave. The man blocked her path. Jake leaned forward, adjusting the focus. This looked like another domestic situation developing. Should he call the police this time? The argument escalated. The woman pushed past the man, heading for the door. He grabbed her arm and spun her around. She stumbled backward, her hands up defensively. The man struck her across the face with an open palm. The woman's head snapped to the side. She lost her balance and fell backward, her skull connecting with the corner of the coffee table with a sound Jake heard even from 4 floors away. She hit the ground and didn't move. The man in the baseball cap stood frozen for a moment, staring down at the motionless woman. Then he knelt beside her, pressing his fingers to her neck. His face went white. Jake's hands shook as he watched the man check for a pulse again, then leaned down to listen for breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the man sat back on his heels and ran his hands through his hair. The woman wasn't moving. Blood was pooling beneath her head. Jake reached for his phone, then stopped. The man in 5B had turned toward the window. For one terrible moment, Jake thought their eyes met across the dark courtyard. But the man looked away, turning his attention back to the body. Moving with sudden purpose, the man disappeared into another room. He returned with plastic sheeting, the kind used for home renovation projects. Working quickly, he began wrapping the woman's body. Jake's coffee mug slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. The sound made him jump, but when he looked back at 5B, the man was still focused on his grisly work. By 10:30, the apartment was dark again. The man was gone. The woman was gone. If Jake hadn't witnessed it himself, he would never have known anything had happened. But it had happened. Someone was dead. And Jake was the only person who knew. Jake didn't sleep that night. He replayed the scene obsessively, zooming in on every detail in his memory. The woman's red jacket, the sound of her head hitting the table, the way the man had checked for vital signs with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it before. By dawn, Jake had convinced himself he'd imagined the whole thing. The lighting in 5B was poor. The telephoto lens could distort perspective. Maybe the woman had just been unconscious. Maybe she'd gotten up after Jake stopped watching. But deep down, he knew what he'd seen. A woman had died in apartment 5B, and her killer was walking around free. At 8 a.m., Jake called the police non-emergency line. "I'd like to report a possible assault," he told the dispatcher. "What's your name and location, sir?" Jake gave his information, then stumbled through an explanation. "I witnessed what looked like a domestic violence incident last night. A man hit a woman, and she fell and hit her head." "Are you certain the woman was injured, Mr. Morrison?" "She wasn't moving. There was blood." "Did you check on the woman yourself? Did you see medical personnel respond to the scene?" Jake hesitated. "No, I was watching from my apartment window. Across the courtyard." The dispatcher's tone became more cautious. "How far away were you from this incident, sir?" 4 floors up, maybe 100 feet away." "And what exactly did you see?" Jake tried to describe the scene without mentioning the telephoto lens. It sounded weak even to his own ears, a distant observation of an argument that might have gotten physical. Without being able to provide the woman's name, the exact apartment number, or any follow-up information, his report carried no weight. "We'll make a note of your call, Mr. Morrison. If you have any additional information or witness similar activity, please contact us again." Jake hung up feeling more helpless than before. He'd done the right thing by calling, but it wasn't enough. The police couldn't investigate based on his vague report from across a courtyard. At noon, Jake watched the man from 5B leave his apartment and walk to the parking garage. He looked completely normal, just another resident heading out for weekend errands. No signs of guilt or panic. No indication that he'd killed someone 12 hours earlier. The man returned an hour later with groceries. He made several trips from his car to the apartment, carrying ordinary shopping bags. If there was a body to dispose of, he wasn't doing it in broad daylight. Jake spent the rest of Saturday positioned by his window, documenting everything. The man's routine. His car, a dark blue sedan with Colorado plates. The times he came and went. Every detail that might be useful if the police ever took his report seriously. But as the day wore on, Jake began to doubt himself again. The man's behavior was so normal. Too normal for someone who just committed murder. Maybe Jake had misunderstood what he'd seen. Maybe his weeks of isolation and voyeurism had finally made him paranoid. Sunday morning brought a new possibility. The man in the baseball cap made multiple trips to the building's basement, carrying large black garbage bags. The trips were quick and purposeful, and the man checked the hallway carefully each time. Jake's blood went cold. The Riverside lofts had storage units in the basement, along with the building's dumpster and recycling area. If someone wanted to hide evidence, or a body, the basement would be perfect. Jake knew he had to see for himself. Monday afternoon, when the man from 5B had been gone for over 2 hours, Jake strapped on his crutches and made his way to the elevator. The basement was accessible to all residents, but Jake had never been down there. His storage unit was on the 2nd floor, and he'd never had reason to explore the building's lower levels. The basement was dimly lit and smelled of concrete dust and old cardboard. Rows of storage units lined the walls, each secured with a simple padlock. At the far end, Jake could see the building's maintenance area and dumpster room. Unit 5B's storage space was in the 3rd row, marked with the same number as the apartment. Jake hobbled over on his crutches, trying to look casual in case anyone else was down there. The padlock on 5B's unit looked new, shiny brass that hadn't had time to tarnish. The concrete floor around the unit was stained with something dark that might have been oil or might have been something else entirely. Jake was examining the stains when he heard footsteps on the basement stairs. Panic flooded his system. He turned toward the sound, moving as quickly as his crutches would allow. But the footsteps were coming faster, taking the stairs 2 at a time. The man in the baseball cap appeared at the bottom of the stairs, just as Jake reached the elevator. Their eyes met across the basement. "You okay down there?" the man asked. His voice was friendly, but his eyes were cold. Jake's mouth went dry. "Yeah, just dropped my keys." He held up his key ring as evidence. "Hard to bend over with this thing." He gestured to his cast. The man walked closer. Up close, he was bigger than he looked through the telephoto lens, maybe 6'2" with the build of someone who worked with his hands. The baseball cap was pulled low, shadowing his face. "That looks painful," the man said, nodding at Jake's leg. "How'd you do it?" "Slipped on some ice." "Stupid accident." "Those are the worst kind." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Derek, by the way." 5B. Jake. 4C. 4C, that's the corner unit, right? Great windows. Jake's blood chilled. Derek knew which apartment he lived in. Knew about the windows. "Yeah, the light's good for work," Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. "What kind of work do you do, Jake?" "Photography. Weddings, mostly." Derek nodded slowly. "Must be tough, being laid up like that." Nothing to do but sit by those big windows all day. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Derek knew Jake had been watching. The question was, did he know how much Jake had seen? The elevator dinged, and Jake hobbled inside as quickly as possible. "See you around," he called as the doors closed. Derek waved, still smiling his cold smile. Jake triple-locked his apartment door and closed all the blinds. His hands shook as he poured himself a drink, cheap whiskey that burned his throat and did nothing to calm his nerves. Derek knew he'd been watching. The comment about the windows made that clear. But did he know about Friday night? Jake replayed their conversation, looking for clues. Derek's questions had been casual, but there was intelligence behind his eyes. This wasn't a random killer who'd lost control in a moment of passion. Derek was calculating. Dangerous. The smart thing would be to leave. Pack a bag, check into a hotel, and let the police handle it. But Jake couldn't afford a hotel, and what would he tell the police? That he'd been spying on his neighbors and witnessed a murder he couldn't prove? Instead, Jake did what he'd been doing for weeks. He watched. But now Derek was watching back. Through his telephoto lens, Jake could see into 5B's apartment again. Derek had left the curtains slightly open, maybe deliberately. He sat on his couch, drinking beer and watching TV. Occasionally, he looked toward Jake's windows. At midnight, Derek got up and approached his window. He stood there for a long moment, looking directly at Jake's apartment. Then he raised his hand and waved. Jake jerked back from his own window, his heart hammering. Derek couldn't possibly see him in the dark apartment, but somehow he knew Jake was there. The message was clear: "I know you're watching me." Tuesday brought new developments. Derek left his apartment early and didn't return until evening. While he was gone, Jake noticed unusual activity around the building. A cleaning service van parked in the loading dock. Men in coveralls carrying equipment into the basement. When Derek returned, he made another trip to the basement with garbage bags. But this time, he propped open the door to the stairwell. He wanted Jake to see him. Wednesday night, Jake heard footsteps in the hallway outside his apartment. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped right outside his door. Jake held his breath, waiting for a knock that never came. After 5 minutes, the footsteps moved away. Thursday morning, Jake found a note slipped under his door. "Nice camera equipment. You should be more careful with it." Derek had been in his apartment. or at least close enough to see inside. Jake checked his locks. Still secure, but somehow Derek had gotten close enough to inventory his photography gear. Jake was no longer just a witness. He was a target. Friday night, exactly 1 week after the murder, Derek made his move. Jake was positioned by his window, telephoto lens ready, when he saw Derek leaving his apartment. But instead of heading to the parking garage, Derek walked toward the building's main entrance. Toward Jake's building. The Riverside Lofts had 6 separate buildings around the courtyard, but they were all connected by a network of hallways and stairwells. Derek could reach Jake's floor without going outside. Jake grabbed his phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's trying to break into my apartment, Jake said, keeping his voice low. Are you in immediate danger, sir? I think so. There's a man. Jake stopped. How could he explain without sounding insane? I witnessed a crime last week, and now the perpetrator is targeting me. What's your address? Jake gave his information, but he could hear the skepticism in the dispatcher's voice. Without concrete evidence of a break-in in progress, the police response would be slow. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside Jake's apartment. Derek wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. A sharp knock rattled Jake's door. Jake? You in there? Derek's voice was casual friendly. It's Derek from 5B. I wanted to talk to you about something. Jake said nothing, barely breathing. I know you're in there, Jake. I can see the light under your door. Another knock, harder this time. Come on, man. We're neighbors. Just want to chat. The door handle turned. Jake had locked it, but the sound sent ice through his veins. Look, Jake, I know you've been watching everyone. It's okay, I get it. You're laid up, bored out of your mind. But sometimes people see things that aren't their business. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from 911, officers dispatched to your location. ETA 8 to 10 minutes. 8 to 10 minutes might as well be 8 hours. Here's the thing, Derek continued. I think you might have misunderstood something you saw last week. People argue, you know? Sometimes things look worse than they are from a distance. Jake heard metal scraping against metal. Derek was working on the lock. The woman you saw, Amy, she's fine. Just had too much to drink and took a little tumble. Happens to the best of us. The scraping sound grew louder. She went home to sleep it off. Nothing dramatic. Jake knew Derek was lying. Dead women didn't go home to sleep off head injuries. With shaking hands, Jake pulled out his phone and opened the camera app. If Derek killed him, at least there would be evidence. Video proof of who'd done it. The lock clicked open. Jake hit the building's fire alarm. The piercing shriek filled the air, emergency lights flashing in the hallways. Within seconds, apartment doors were opening throughout the building. Residents emerged, confused and annoyed, heading for the fire exits. In the chaos, Jake heard Derek cursing in the hallway. The man couldn't break into an apartment with dozens of witnesses streaming past the door. Jake grabbed his crutches and joined the evacuation, mixing with the crowd of residents heading downstairs. In the parking lot, he found a police car just arriving, the 911 response he'd requested. Officer, I'm Jake Morrison. I called about a break-in. The policeman looked skeptical. Sir, this appears to be a fire alarm, not a break-in. I pulled the alarm, Jake said. The man who was trying to get into my apartment, he's here somewhere. Jake scanned the crowd of evacuees, looking for Derek's baseball cap. Derek was nowhere to be seen. Sir, if you falsely activated a fire alarm. He killed someone, Jake said desperately. Last Friday night. I saw it happen. The officer's expression shifted from skepticism to concern, not about Derek, but about Jake's mental state. Why don't we go talk somewhere quiet? The officer suggested, guiding Jake away from the crowd. Jake spent the next hour trying to explain the situation to 2 police officers and a fire marshal. Without evidence, His story sounded like the paranoid delusions of an isolated man who'd been cooped up too long. But when they returned to Jake's apartment, they found his door standing open and his camera equipment missing. Derek had gotten what he came for. "This changes things," Officer Martinez said, examining Jake's violated apartment. "Breaking and entering, theft of property, these are serious crimes. We can investigate this." But Jake knew the theft was just a message. Derek had taken the cameras to show he could take anything he wanted. Next time, it might be Jake's life. While the police dusted for fingerprints and took photos, Jake realized something important. Derek's apartment had been empty during the evacuation, but his car was still in the parking garage. He hadn't fled the building. He was hiding somewhere inside. "Officer Martinez," Jake said. "The man I've been telling you about lives in 5B. Derek something. While you're here, maybe you could check on him. Make sure he's okay after the fire alarm." Martinez looked annoyed. "Mr. Morrison, we can't just harass residents based on your suspicions. You're not harassing him. You're doing a welfare check after a fire alarm. Standard procedure, right?" Martinez exchanged glances with his partner. "Fine. But this needs to stop being about your neighbor-watching obsession." 20 minutes later, Martinez returned with news. 5B is vacant, he said. Has been for 2 weeks, according to the building manager. The previous tenant moved out suddenly, left most of his stuff behind. Jake's blood went cold. "That's impossible. I've seen Derek going in and out all week." Building manager says no one named Derek is on the lease. Previous tenant was someone named Michael Hoffman. Left without giving notice, abandoned his security deposit. The pieces clicked together in Jake's mind. Derek wasn't just a killer. He was a squatter. He'd been using the vacant apartment as a base of operations, probably picking locks to get in and out. Michael Hoffman was likely victim number 1. "Officer, you need to check that storage unit in the basement. 5B's unit. Derek's been making trips down there with garbage bags." This time, Martinez took him seriously. The building manager led them to the basement with a master key. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the stains around storage unit 5B looked darker and more ominous. Martinez cut the padlock with bolt cutters. The smell hit them first, sweet and rotting, unmistakable to anyone who'd encountered it before. Martinez immediately called for backup and the coroner. Inside the unit, wrapped in plastic sheeting, were 2 bodies. A man in his 30s with multiple stab wounds, Michael Hoffman, based on the ID in his wallet, and a woman in a red jacket with a head injury consistent with blunt force trauma, Amy, the woman Jake had watched die. "Mr. Morrison," Martinez said, his voice grim. "We're going to need a very detailed statement from you. Everything you saw when you saw it, and anything else you can remember about this Derek character." Jake nodded, feeling sick. 2 people were dead, and he was the only witness who could help catch their killer. But Derek was still out there, somewhere in the building. Still hunting. The Riverside Lofts became a crime scene. Police cordoned off the basement and began searching every vacant unit in all 6 buildings. Residents were evacuated temporarily while officers swept for Derek, who had apparently been using the complex's abandoned spaces as his own personal hunting ground. Jake gave his statement to Detective Sarah Chen, a sharp-eyed woman who listened to his story without judgment. Unlike the first officers, Chen understood the value of witness testimony, even from an admittedly voyeuristic source. "You probably saved lives," she told Jake as they reviewed his timeline of Derek's activities. This guy was escalating. 2 victims in 3 months, using the building's layout to move around undetected. He would have killed again. But Derek had vanished like smoke. The search of the building turned up evidence of his presence. Improvised sleeping areas in maintenance rooms, picked locks on several storage units, and signs he'd been siphoning electricity from utility panels. He'd been living like a ghost in the walls, invisible to residents and management alike. His car was found abandoned in a neighboring complex, wiped clean of fingerprints. Security cameras showed Derek leaving the building during the fire alarm evacuation, but the trail went cold after that. He's smart, Chen admitted. Probably military or law enforcement background, based on his operational security. But we'll get him. Men like this don't stop killing, they just move to new hunting grounds. Jake returned to his apartment under police protection, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow in the courtyard might hide Derek. Every noise in the hallway might signal his return. The other residents looked at Jake differently now. Some with gratitude. He'd exposed a killer in their midst. Others with suspicion. What kind of person spies on neighbors through telescopic lenses? Ken and Blondie from 3B approached him in the lobby 3 days after Derek's disappearance. "We heard what you did," Ken said, his voice awkward. "About the killer." "Thank you." Jake studied the man who'd been hitting his girlfriend. "Is she okay?" he asked, nodding toward Blondie. Ken's face darkened. "That's none of your business." "Actually, it is," Jake replied quietly. "I've been watching you hurt her for weeks. I was too much of a coward to do anything about it, but that's changing." Blondie, whose real name was Sarah, stepped forward. "He's getting help," she said. "We both are. Anger management and couples therapy." Jake hoped it was true. His weeks of watching had taught him that real life was more complicated than it looked from a distance. People weren't just heroes or villains. They were human beings struggling with problems that couldn't be solved by outside observers. But some problems required intervention. Derek had taught him that lesson in blood. 3 weeks later, Derek was captured in Denver, trying to break into an apartment building similar to the Riverside Lofts. A security guard who'd read about the murders in Denver recognized Derek's description and called police. Detective Chen called Jake with the news. "He confessed to both murders," she said. "Claims he was looking for empty apartments to squat in when he encountered the victims. Michael Hoffman caught him breaking into 5B, so Derek killed him to keep from being reported. Amy Henderson was a sex worker he'd hired, killed her when she threatened to expose his squatting operation." "Just like that?" Jake asked. "2 people dead because they inconvenienced him?" "Some people have no value for human life," Chen replied. "But thanks to your testimony, he'll never hurt anyone else." Life in prison. No possibility of parole. The news should have brought closure, but Jake felt hollow. His vigilance had helped catch a killer, but it couldn't bring back the dead or erase his own complicity. He'd watched violence escalate for weeks, both Derek's and Ken's, without taking meaningful action until it was too late. His leg healed slowly. Physical therapy was painful but productive. By the end of month 3, Jake was walking without crutches and starting to book photography jobs again. But he found himself changed by the experience. The isolation and forced observation had given him a different perspective on human nature. People weren't just subjects to be captured in perfect moments. They were complex beings living messy, complicated lives. His photography evolved too. Instead of just weddings and portraits, Jake began documenting urban life. Street photography that captured the connections and disconnections of city living. The ways people shared space without sharing lives. The images were darker than his previous work, but more honest. They reflected what he'd learned during those weeks by the window. That watching wasn't the same as seeing, and seeing wasn't the same as understanding. The Riverside Lofts installed better security after the murders. Card key access to all buildings, security cameras in common areas, and regular patrols by off-duty police officers. The building manager, embarrassed by the revelation that a killer had been squatting in vacant units, implemented strict protocols for monitoring empty apartments. Jake kept the telephoto lens, but he didn't use it to watch his neighbors anymore. Privacy, he learned, was precious. The temptation to observe was always there. Humans were naturally curious about each other, But crossing the line from awareness to voyeurism was easier than most people realized. Mr. Peterson still tended his rooftop garden, but Jake learned his first name was Harold when they met in the lobby one afternoon. Harold had been a high school English teacher for 40 years and was writing a memoir about education in America. They began having coffee together on Sundays, two lonely men who'd found friendship through proximity rather than voyeurism. Linda Martinez became more than a subject of observation too. When Jake was mobile again, he offered to photograph her kids for free, professional portraits she couldn't afford on her freelance income. The photo session led to other conversations, and Jake learned that Linda was studying for a nursing degree while working 3 part-time jobs. He began recommending her web design services to his wedding clients. Sarah and Ken from 3B moved out 2 months after Derek's arrest. Jake hoped their relationship problems would improve with distance from the place where they'd fought so bitterly. Before they left, Sarah knocked on Jake's door. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not just for catching the killer, but for witnessing. I know that sounds strange, but knowing someone saw what was happening made me realize it wasn't normal. It gave me the courage to demand we get help." Jake accepted her thanks, though he still felt guilty about not intervening sooner. Some forms of watching were necessary, the kind that recognized when people needed help and took action to provide it. The college kids in 1A graduated and moved on, replaced by a young couple with a baby who cried at all hours. The crying bothered some residents, but Jake found it comforting. It was the sound of life continuing, of hope persisting even in a place marked by violence. 6 months after the murders, Jake's landlord offered him a different unit, one with a view of the street instead of the courtyard. "Better natural light," the landlord said. "More privacy." Jake turned down the offer. He'd learned that privacy and isolation weren't the same thing. The courtyard view reminded him daily that he was part of a community, whether he acknowledged it or not. The difference was in how he chose to participate, as a secret observer or as a neighbor willing to engage with the messy reality of other people's lives. The telephoto lens stayed in his camera bag, unused but not forgotten. It served as a reminder of the thin line between curiosity and violation, between watching and seeing, between being a witness and being a participant in the human story unfolding around him. On quiet evenings, Jake still sat by his window, but instead of peering into other people's lives, he read Harold's memoir chapters or edited photographs that captured the beauty and complexity of genuine human connection. The courtyard below remained full of stories. Love affairs and family dramas, celebrations and sorrows, the endless cycle of people trying to build meaningful lives in proximity to strangers. But now Jake was part of those stories, not just an observer of them. He learned that the most important view wasn't through a telephoto lens but through the open door of genuine human engagement. The window had taught him to see. Now it was time to learn how to live with his eyes wide open. Epilogue. 1 year later, Jake's photography exhibition opened at a gallery downtown. Urban Intimacy, Life in Close Quarters, featured images of city dwellers navigating the space between privacy and community. The centerpiece was a series called The Watchers, photographs of people in their windows, framed by the architecture that both separated and connected them to their neighbors. Harold Peterson attended the opening, dressed in his best suit and beaming with pride at seeing his rooftop garden featured in several shots. Linda Martinez brought her kids, who were thrilled to see their portraits displayed alongside the work of a real artist. Sarah sent a card from Portland, where she was attending law school and volunteering at a domestic violence shelter. Detective Chin stopped by after her shift, studying the photographs with the analytical eye of someone who understood the importance of observation. "You've got a good eye for human nature," she told Jake. "Ever consider a career change? The police department could use someone who knows how to really see what's happening." Jake smiled but shook his head. "I think I'll stick to capturing the good moments," he said. "There are enough people watching for the bad ones." The exhibition was well received. leading to commissions and gallery representation. But the real success was simpler. Jake had found his voice as an artist and his place as a neighbor. The broken leg that had initially seemed like a disaster had forced him to slow down and pay attention to the world around him. He still lived in the riverside lofts, still had the same view of the courtyard. But the person looking out that window was fundamentally different from the isolated man who'd first picked up a telephoto lens out of boredom. Derek Williams was serving life without parole in a supermax prison in Colorado. His name occasionally appeared in the news when journalists wrote about urban crime or housing security. For Jake, Derek represented the dark side of watching. Observation motivated by predation rather than connection, by the desire to harm rather than understand. The difference between the two kinds of watching, Jake had learned, lay not in the act of observation itself, but in what the observer chose to do with what they saw. The choice between turning away and stepping forward. Between silence and action. Between remaining hidden behind the glass and opening the door to genuine human connection. In the end, the most important lesson Jake learned during those weeks by the window wasn't about his neighbors' secrets or the killer in their midst. It was about the responsibility that came with seeing, the obligation to act when action was needed, to help when help was possible, and to remember that every window was both a barrier and a portal. The view from 4C hadn't changed, but Jake's perspective had been transformed completely. And in that transformation, he'd found not just his art but his humanity. The window that had once been his prison had become his teacher, showing him that the most meaningful stories weren't the ones you watched from a distance, but the ones you chose to enter, with all the risks and rewards that came with genuine human engagement. Jake Morrison had learned to see. Now he was learning to live. The end. We encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed the video. Please share your thoughts in the comments section and explore our channel for a diverse range of content, including audiobooks, murder mysteries, psychological thrillers, and classic novels. We strive to provide comprehensive and engaging storytelling experiences. Your visit is highly appreciated, and we are confident you will find content to your liking.